This week I'm checking out another RPG from famed developer Square. No, not Square Enix, because this was made before their merger. It's Final Fantasy II, or 4 if you're playing the Japanese version. I realized that I didn't give the brief history of the Final Fantasy numbering system in my Final Fantasy VI review, so here's a quick explanation on why it has two different numbers for the same game. In America, we first got Final Fantasy on the NES. This remains the same in both America and Japan. After this, Japan got two NES sequels in Final Fantasy II and III. However, those games were never ported to the US until much later. When Final Fantasy IV was released in Japan, Square decided to bring it overseas, but as to not confuse us on where the missing games were, they simply called it Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy V was once again refused to us American gamers, but Final Fantasy VI did come stateside. But once again, the number was switched to 3 since it was the third game that we received. However, when the PlayStation came out and the next Final Fantasy game graced it, Square just said, screw it, let's just call it Final Fantasy VII and be done with the screwy numbering. Unlike Final Fantasy VI/3, which didn't have any major changes, Final Fantasy II/4 has quite a bit of difference between the American and Japanese release. Final Fantasy II is often preceded by the words easy type, signifying that the game is significantly less of a challenge. After playing both games, I can verify that it is a bit easier, but the final dungeon is still ball-bustingly hard. I'll run down a few of the changes after I go down the roster of characters we'll be playing as. I guess I should start with the story though. Your main character is a dark knight named Cecil, who is the captain of the Baron Red Wings. Think of these guys as your elite airborne military. The game starts with Cecil obtaining one of the final crystals from a magical town known as Mysidia. Cecil is a bit unnerved because the townspeople hardly put up a fight, so Cecil decides to confront the king about it. Upon doing so, the king thinks that Cecil is being far too rebellious, so he demotes him from his position as Red Wing captain and sends him on a small journey to a village named Mist to deliver a package. He also orders Cecil's good friend, the Dragoon Cain, to travel with him. Upon doing so, Cecil's package opens up, releasing a bomb that destroys the town. A single girl survives, and she turns out to be a summoner. This girl, Rydia, summons her Titan, which creates a massive earthquake, splitting up Cecil and Cain. From here, Cecil brings Rydia to an inn to heal her wounds, and confronts a group of soldiers from Baron that want to eliminate Cecil. From here, the game proceeds on. I could summarize the entire thing since I've played this game many times, but I will refrain from doing so, since the storyline in RPGs are often the best parts of the game. So about those characters. You start with Cecil, and as I already mentioned, he's a Dark Knight of Baron as the leader of the Red Wings. He starts out with heavy armor, and about a quarter of the way in the game, he changes classes. He ends up in the village of Mysidia, and they tell him that they will only help him if he can denounce his evil ways. As such, he heads to the top of the nearby mountains and engages in a spiritual battle to go from evil to good. As a paladin, he gains a few magic spells, although his magical power is minimal, even for a paladin. Once he comes out into the light side, he will also automatically protect any party members that are in critical condition. The next character you meet is Cain, a Dragoon, or Dragon Knight. He has access to an incredibly powerful attack known as Jump, where he, jumps high into the air and comes down on an opponent. With the Jump ability, you should never use the basic fight option. He primarily wields spears and axes and has no magical powers whatsoever. He comes and goes in your party frequently, but it's always nice to have him fighting alongside of you. Third is Rydia, the summoner from Mist. She starts off physically frail, being able to be defeated in a few quick hits, and her strength is non-existent. Instead, she focuses on primarily being a spellcaster. In the beginning of the game, she can cast both white and black magic, along with her summons. Later on in the game, she takes a small hiatus from your party due to some story twists, but when she comes back, she's much more powerful magically. She still won't be able to take a hit though, and in the second half of the game, she loses the ability to cast white magic. Although she can equip rods, staffs, bows, and whips, I just recommended the whips and bows. Bows do a lot of damage but require arrows, whereas whips do a bit less but don't require any additional ammo, and can often paralyze your enemies. Fourth up is Tella, another magician. He's a bit more resilient than Rydia, and can have a slightly better repertoire of spells, especially later in the game. You meet him early, and he begs Cecil for help in defeating an octopus-style boss. You won't have him in your party often, so don't equip him with anything you want to keep. Soon after meeting Tella, you'll encounter Edward, a bard. He's sadly almost useless in combat. He wields harps, which have a chance of putting a monster to sleep or confusing them, but other than that, his physical abilities are really lacking. In addition, when in combat and his HP becomes dangerously low, he'll automatically use his hide skill, which essentially makes him run away. He's often called a coward in the game, and it's no wonder why. He does have one major use later on in the game in regards to the plot, but other than that, you won't miss him when he leaves your party. Eventually, you finally get access to Rosa, Cecil's girlfriend and the white mage of the group. Her weapon of choice is a bow, although she will equip the typical magic weapons. As the white mage, she of course has access to a slew of healing spells. She also has a decent defensive stat for a magic user. Unfortunately, she'll come and go a few times, just like Kain, but you do get to use her much more frequently, of which you'll be grateful for, just for her healing skills. She also has access to an ability called Aim, which increases her accuracy when using a bow. This should always be used instead of fight when using the bows. Yang is next, and he's your typical bare-handed monk character. He doesn't have much to equip in regards to armor, but he does get access to a few claws that would attach a few elements or specialties to his attack. These claws, on average, do not increase his attack strength though, so it's really up to your preference on what you want to equip Yang with. He'll officially join your party when you help out his kingdom, who is under attack by the newly upgraded Baron Redwings. Yang also has a kick attack available, which does damage to every enemy on the screen, but for a decreased amount of damage. Pelham and Porum are twins, and you get to add them to your party when Cecil's ship crashes on his way to Baron to rescue Rosa when she was abducted in Fabu, Yang's hometown. Pelham and Porum are originally tasked with assisting Cecil, but they have a more ulterior motive, which is revealed once Cecil becomes a paladin. Don't worry, these two kids aren't evil in any way. Both of them are wizards in training. Pelham is the black mage with a mouth, and Porum is a more light-hearted white mage. Both of them are very frail, as is to be expected. Both of them have access to a special attack called Twin, which allows them to spend, I think it's 20 MP to use a powerful skill. You need to be careful though, because repeatedly using this will drain the MP quickly. Next to want to get on the action is Sid, who happens to be the main engineer for Baron. He'll join you after defeating a few notable enemies in Baron when you return to your hometown. He is a powerhouse of sorts, having high amounts of HP with a high physical attack. He actually fights by whacking enemies with his wrench. He's not actually in your party for long, which is a shame because he hits hard. His extra skill is to scan his enemies to give you their current HP, which you probably won't use too often. Next on the list we have Edge, the stereotypical rebellious prince that also happens to be a ninja, although a shitty one at that. He can easily equip 2 swords at any one time, really buffing up his offense, but he's so physically weak it's still recommended that you keep him in the back row. Even there, he can fall after only a few hits. He's got a hard-on for revenge against Rubicon, one of the 4 elemental minions, since he thinks that Rubicon killed his family. The truth is revealed later on in the game, but Edge is still determined to get payback. Edge also has 3 special abilities. One is a ninjutsu style magic. These spells are mostly elemental in nature and can do some moderate damage. He can also throw things. You'll find various ninja stars and chests in the later dungeons of the game, but he can also throw old weapons that you may not want anymore. Finally, Edge can also steal from his enemies. However, it's not very successful, and if you fail, Edge may get hurt and take a bit of damage. Honestly, I found that the success was too inconsistent to even bother using frequently. Finally, we have Fusoya, a guy who lives on the moon. That's right, the moon. He has access to almost every spell in the game right from the start, and can also cast white and black magic. He's the one to finally start wrapping up the plot, but not always revealed until the final moments of the game. He isn't in your party for long, but you'll be enjoying his company when you have it. So that's the roster of good guys, but of course you have the evil ones too. Golbez is the main baddie, and you'll find him only a handful of times. You'll find out that he's not exactly the worst guy out there, but I won't spoil why he's not. He does employ a few minions to assist him. The main ones are the 4 elemental masters. You have Scarmiglione, the Fiend of Earth. You'll actually fight him right before Cecil becomes a paladin, and then a second time right afterwards. He's weak against fire, especially in the second fight, so Pelham and Teller will be essential in defeating him. The second minion is Cognazo, the Fiend of Water. Naturally, you're going to want to spam lightning attacks. He'll eventually bring up a shield of water, but blasting it with lightning will bring it down. Overall, the fight isn't too bad. The Fiend of Wind is Valvolus, and she is equally as easy if you can get her pattern down. She'll change forms a few times, which dictate which attacks she'll use. However, if she goes into tornado form, she'll have a great defense and counterattack. Have Kain jump to stop her from spinning around. Finally, we come to Rubicon. He's the Fiend of Fire, but as evil as he may sound, he actually has honor, and he flat out says that he didn't kill Edge's parents. He will also heal you before fighting him, saying that he prefers a fair fight. He usually keeps his cape around him, which will absorb all magical attacks, but once he flips it back, you'll want to blast him with as many ice spells as possible. You will fight each of these guys 2 times, and the second time you'll have to fight them all one after another. At this point, you're probably going to understand their attack patterns, so it shouldn't be too much of a challenge to destroy them. Let me touch on the differences between the 2 versions now, since the biggest changes are with the characters. For one, there's a lot of name changes, which is to be expected during the translation. Most notable in translations, at least in my opinion, is the Americanized version of the Cleaver, a hidden weapon that can be found from Yang's wife. It's the most powerful throwing weapon for Edge. For some unknown reason, instead of a cleaver, in the US version, it's a spoon. A fucking spoon? The hell? How can that hurt, even if a ninja can throw it? Another minor thing is that instead of a guillotine that's threatening to behead Rosa in the Tower of Babel, it's now just a metal ball that will crush her skull. I don't understand how less violent that is. There's also supposedly an item called a porno book in a hidden room in the first Dwarven Castle. Of course, Nintendo of America probably didn't like the idea of that, so it was taken out. The biggest missing part of Final Fantasy II Easy Type was the additional skills a lot of the characters had during battle. I'll list them all because they were oftentimes incredibly useful. Cecil, as a Dark Knight, had a power that would sacrifice a bit of his HP but attack every enemy on the screen. It could be compared to the Darkness skill in a lot of the later Final Fantasy games. He loses this ability when he becomes a Paladin, but until then, it was very helpful. Tella had an ability that would randomly cast any spell in the game, provided he had the MP for it. This means that in early battles, you could potentially cast a high-level spell and wipe out enemies quickly. Of course, doing so meant possibly wasting MP for a low-level magic, but that was the risk you would take when using this skill. Rosa had an ability that translated to Prayer, and it would heal a very minuscule amount of HP without consuming any MP. Yang was able to power up his attack, and after a little bit of time would unleash it in a more powerful attack. Pelham had an ability that would increase his magical power, and Purim was able to make the party escape a bit easier. Finally, Fusoya was able to cast a small Regent-style skill that would slowly heal the party. I'm unsure why these skills were taken out. Did Square think that with the reduced challenge these skills were unnecessary? I don't get it. The battle system is similar enough to every other Final Fantasy of the time. Your party is on the right, and the enemies are on the left, unless you were ambushed, in which the roles are reversed. Unlike many of the other games, there is a front and a back row for your party. You'll be forced to keep certain members in either row. One row has to have 3 members, and the other mandates that 2 characters occupy it. It's up to you on whether you want 3 characters in the front, or just 2. You can change this option in the menu. It's best to choose this option based on what characters you have available. For example, on the mountain where Cecil becomes a paladin, you may want to have Cecil in the front and Tella, Pelham, and Purim in the rear. Speaking of, I find it kind of annoying in that your party members are constantly shifting around. You start with Cecil and Kain, then lose Kain but gain Rydia. You'll find Tella and Edward soon after, lose Edward, gain Rosa, lose all but Cecil, gain Pelham and Purim, and good god, the madness. Just let me keep the characters. I get it, it all pertains to the plot. I still find it kind of annoying. Just when you start getting used to the perks and downsides of a character, you might lose them. Back to the battles. Unlike later games which had the meters show when a character would be able to attack, instead of Final Fantasy II, no such meter is shown. Therefore, you're never really sure who is going to be available next, which can ruin any sort of tactics you may have been planning to use. You can also run away from most battles, but in doing so, you run the risk of dropping gold. This may not seem like a huge issue, but equipment is expensive, so in the beginning of the game, you may be scrounging up everything that you can find just to afford equipping your characters with stuff that will keep them alive. Another quirk that I have with the game is the shop system. There's nothing really wrong with it, per se, but what I don't like is that when buying new gear, you won't be sure on whether it will help your character or not until you purchase it and then equip it. You may find that the stuff you found in the previous dungeon is better than the stuff you can buy in the town you just encountered. But you won't know until you spend the money, and then to sell back to the shopkeeper would be laughing because he's profiting off your lack of knowledge. Ugh. At least this is fixed in later games, where there would be arrows to show whether or not a gear is a valuable upgrade. The music of Final Fantasy II is just plain fantastic. The overworld map is peaceful sounding, but mysterious at the same time. When you enter caves, you're brought to a darker sounding theme. The music that plays when flying around an airship feels appropriate for someone that's flying around. Overall, I would recommend the soundtrack if you're into that kind of thing. Granted, I think Final Fantasy VI is better, but for an earlier Final Fantasy game, it's definitely worth checking out. There's quite a bit of humor in the game, especially once you reach the Dwarven cities in the underground. The dwarves are all happy-go-lucky, all cheerful and eager to help out Cecil's cause. My favorite parts are when Cid is trying to make Edge help to upgrade their airship. Instead of helping out, Edge pauses to hit on Rosa and Rydia. It's known throughout the game that Edge is a womanizer, but the female characters just won't have it. Cid pulls Edge away and there's a screaming match between the two, which Cid naturally wins. It's all done without dialogue, but the animations shown are just enough for you to know what's going on. Graphically, the game looks primitive at some points, but beautiful in others. A lot of the enemies look a bit strange, but given that this is an earlier SNES game, it can't be helped. Then again, other things like water in the caverns to summon monsters look amazing. I love how you can look in the cave and see the floors beneath it, eventually finding out that there's a small town of peaceful monsters living in the bottom. One thing I didn't particularly care for are the spell animations. They seem a bit too basic to me, save for a few like Ice 3 or Fire 3. One other thing that I want to mention is something I kinda don't understand. Nintendo of America was big on censoring things that resembled anything to do with heavy violence or religion. Yet there's a large tower in the game called the Tower of Babel. It's a tower that was created to obtain power from the moon from the ground. I think this could potentially be a biblical reference. In the Bible, the Tower of Babel was a structure that was being constructed by the human race to reach heaven from the earth. God stopped its construction by making all the builders speak in different languages. Maybe I'm reading too far into this, but I just think this may be a biblical reference. How's the challenge of Final Fantasy II compared to 4? Well, after playing both, I can say that although Final Fantasy II is a bit easier, the final dungeon is still brutal. You'll encounter enemies that cannot be escaped, such as the behemoths. Save points can be a bit scarce, meaning that the encounters inside the treasure boxes for the most powerful equipment can be a bit risky if you lose, since you'll need to start from the last save. Once you get to the final boss, you'll find that he's not entirely difficult. Sure, he has a few hard-hitting attacks, like Big Bang, but overall, if you use your strongest attacks, he'll fall and you'll be able to see the lengthy ending. In fact, there's a boss about halfway through the game that I would consider to be much harder than the final boss. It's the Demon Wall, a beast of a wall that attempts to petrify your party. If it gets too close to you, it'll start performing an attack that immediately kills a party member. You have to hit hard and fast. Couple this with the trapdoors, enemies that will randomly transform into another enemy after killing off one of your characters, and you'll need to be selective on your healing, especially if you don't have many life potions. All in all, short of the brutality of the final dungeon, this one is sure to challenge you. Lengthwise, you're going to be putting in a lot of hours. I think I clocked in at about 30 or 40 hours, and that was with minimal grinding for leveling up. There are a few side quests that can help drag it on a bit. You can attempt to attain the spoon if you want the strongest throwing weapon, although it can only be used once. There's plenty of powerful weapons and armor to find in the final dungeons of the game. There's also many hidden summons. You can find Odin in the Baron Castle basement, Ashura and Leviathan in the Cave of Summoned Monsters, Bahamut in a cave on the moon, and also some basic enemies that drop their summons, although these aren't really worth it. There's also the infamous Pink Puff, which has a 1 in 64 chance of appearing, and a 1 in 64 chance of dropping a pink tail, which can be exchanged for some extremely powerful armor. Worth it? Only if you have the patience. Overall, Final Fantasy II is a fantastic game. Sure, I may like the others a bit better, and there's a couple of weird quirks, especially in the overseas porting of the game, but that doesn't mean it's a bad RPG. It's got an enticing and addicting story, easy to learn gameplay, and you can't help but hate Golbez for all of his shenanigans. It's also refreshing to see how and why Cecil becomes a paladin, and there's quite a bit of character development for both him, Kain, and Golbez. If you liked any of the other Final Fantasy games, especially in the SNES era, you'll probably want to check it out. It's available on multiple platforms including SNES, PlayStation 1, Game Boy Advance, and now on Steam in an updated and expanded form. So there's no reason for you to say you can't find it. Final score? 9 out of 10. This is Reaper. If you haven't done it yet, check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/ReapersReviews. Happy fragging.